we're discussing the never-ending story. Now, of course, regulars will know yesterday we were discussing the idea that the government going against the fact that the JCVI did not recommend mandating or jabbing 12-year-olds to 15-year-olds. Now the government's saying that they may well continue ahead anyway. But today, the Mail reports that the Health Secretary, Maajid Javed, plans to extend mandatory vaccines from care home workers now to all NHS staff. That's reported in the Mail today. That's why I call it the never-ending story, because this idea of mission creep, this idea that it would never have stopped with, I mean, how do I put this in a way that doesn't sound like too petulant? But frankly, honestly, I am exasperated. I've lost, I've lost all ability not to sigh and look at this situation and wonder why people cannot see what many of us have been attempting to warn people about. It began talking about shifting goalposts. It began, as I said yesterday, with 2 weeks to stop the spread. And then it became about protecting the NHS, when actually the NHS is meant to protect us. From 2 weeks to stop the spread to protecting the NHS, it became about don't kill granny and stay indoors. From there, it was just until we are able to vaccinate all the vulnerable, which is grandpa and grandma and anyone with a pre-existing condition. From there, it became, look, we have to do all of the over 40s to make sure that we can arrive at a level of protection in society. Then it was, we have to vaccinate all adults because we need herd immunity, which, as Sweden kind of demonstrated, you could do in a different way. But until that was happening, we were all in lockdown. From vaccinating all adults, it became about mandating jabs for care workers to protect the vulnerable. And then from there, it continued to vaccinating 16-year-olds with the U-turn that the JCVI made, if you recall. And then, now, they want to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds. It's even being floated that 12 to 15-year-olds may not require parental consent because of Gillick competence, subject to legal challenge. And now Maajid Javed, the Health Secretary, after the less than ceremonial departure of the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, arrived on the scene. People thought perhaps he'd be a breath of fresh air because, sensing public opinion turning against government, they lifted lockdown. And yet here he is, marching on against all recommendations of science and deciding that it makes sense to impose mandatory vaccination for all NHS staff. Now, if you think about this, it makes absolutely no scientific, logical sense. It is discriminatory and there is no logic to it. Why do I say that? And I plead with you to listen carefully to what I say and not react emotionally thinking I'm an anti-vaxxer. What I'm trying to do is explain what the latest evidence indicates about the vaccines and their efficacy, both in terms of infection and transmission terms, and then relate it to mandatory vaccine passports, vaccine mandates. What I'm not talking about is choose not to get jabbed or choose to get jabbed. I have always maintained my belief in the principle that choosing to vaccinate is a decision based upon informed consent that only the individual can make. I am double jabbed. And scientifically speaking, being double jabbed, it still remains the case that you are likely to be affected by reduced symptoms if you were to contract COVID. Having said that, and that's scientifically speaking, so let's continue in the scientific vein. Scientifically speaking, though the vaccinated are less severely infected by COVID, the latest data, both the Oxford study, which is an incredibly extensive study, and real-world data from Israel, indicate the following. This is, the sentence I'm about to utter is genuinely the latest state of play, according to the research, on waning vaccine efficacy against the Delta variant, both in infection and transmission terms. This is currently where the science stands. As reported by Reuters, and as reported by multiple Bloomberg, multiple media outlets, all of which, by the way, I regularly post on my social feeds so that everybody can see what I'm referencing. The latest status of waning vaccine efficacy against the Delta variant of COVID is as follows. The vaccinated, yes, are less severely infected. However, they are more likely to become infected in the first place. Once they are infected, which is more likely for the double jabbed when it comes to the Delta variant, once they are infected with a similar viral load to the unvaccinated, and yet can transmit COVID more easily than those who have recovered from a natural infection. And natural recovery from an infection is more wide-ranging and lasts longer than vaccine-induced immunity. That, dear listeners, is the latest evidence and science on waning vaccine efficacy when it comes to transmission and infection for the Delta variant. I'm going to read that one more time for you. The vaccinated are less severely infected, but they are more likely to become infected in the first place with a similar viral load to the unvaccinated if they are infected, and they can transmit COVID more easily than those who recovered from infection naturally. And natural recovery is more wide-ranging and lasts longer than vaccine-induced immunity. And what I am referencing all of that on is the latest Oxford study, as reported by Reuters themselves, and real-world data coming from Israel, the most vaccinated country in the world. The article in Reuters reporting on the Oxford study, many of you would have heard of this Oxford study anyway, but still, from Thursday, August the 19th, 2021, published by Reuters, headlined, British study shows COVID-19 vaccine efficacy wanes under Delta. The real-world data coming from Israel indicating all of this as well is very well established and reported widely in multiple outlets. But of course, you could, if you wanted to, just refer to news articles in Bloomberg and other mainstream outlets. The point about the fact that the vaccinated are more likely to become infected with Delta in the first place, if you go to Professor of Harvard Medical School, Martin Kulldorff's Twitter feed, he's a professor in Harvard Medical School of Disease Surveillance Methods, Infectious Disease Outbreaks, Vaccine Safety. He's published a piece from Israel National News, and he's put in the tweet the following sentence: vaccinated people were 6.72 times more likely to get infected than those with natural immunity from prior COVID disease. It's difficult for me over radio to fully reference everything I'm saying to you, which is why I urge everybody to go to @Maajid Nawaz, and I regularly post all these articles on my feeds, on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram. The reason I'm being very careful with referencing everything I'm saying to you is because of what I just read to you. The latest state of play when it comes to vaccines is that though the vaccinated are less severely infected, suffer symptoms when they are infected, they are more likely to become infected in the first place with a similar viral load to those who are unvaccinated, yet the double jab can transmit COVID more easily than the unvaccinated, and natural recovery is more wide-ranging and lasts longer than vaccine-induced immunity. That is the latest science. Now, when you hear that, mandated domestic vaccine passports make absolutely no scientific nor logical sense, and then add to that, they are discriminatory, in particular because of the Article 6 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which makes it absolutely clear that consent to any medical treatment can be withdrawn at any time with no negative repercussions whatsoever. That is the state of the science as we now know it. It is unlikely to change. In fact, it's only going to get worse, probably for the double jabbed when it comes to the fact the ability to transmit Delta. Why? Because as many of us have suspected for a long time, rolling out mass vaccination during a pandemic could likely increase the chances of a vaccine-resistant strain of COVID, which is now known as the Delta variant. So when you hear all of this and you understand that to say that I want to impose vaccine passports on cinemas, nightclubs, theatres, NHS staff everywhere, and care homes to stop transmission, when the science indicates that it not only does not stop transmission, but the double jabbed are more likely to transmit it and more likely to become infected in the first place, then you realise it's no longer about the science. It is no longer about the science. That evidence is from Oxford. Oxford, last I checked, is in this country. We don't even need to go to Israel. We can go to that Oxford study. This is all demonstrated here. And so, what's going on? Why are ministers pushing ahead with a mandated domestic vaccine passport, using stopping transmission as the excuse when the science indicates that not only does it not stop transmission, but the vaccinated are more likely to transmit it? Do you think they don't know the science? Do you think that they haven't read these things? Absolutely not. I can guarantee you they're aware of everything I've just said. This is a government we're talking about. Now that leaves me with only one realistic conclusion, and I use the word realistic here deliberately because I don't want to veer off into unfounded territory. The realistic conclusion that I can come to is that this is no longer about health and science, it's about money. It's about conflicts of interest. It's about people that have a vested interest in making sure that all of the big business that is involved in rolling out mandated domestic vaccine passports, from the big tech companies to the big health companies to the big pharmaceutical companies and the revolving door in Westminster, can all continue to be paid at your expense and at the expense of your civil liberties. And the fact is, when I say to you that's the only realistic conclusion, don't take it from me, because think about it. They already knew that this was discriminatory. Do I need to remind you? Just have a listen to Vaccines Minister Nadhim Zahawi prior to this decision being announced in Parliament.
No, we're not. And there are several reasons why we're not doing that. One, vaccines are not mandated in this country, as Boris Johnson's quite rightly reminded Parliament. That's not how we do things in the UK. We do them by consent. We yet don't know what the impact of vaccines on transmission is, and it would be discriminatory. Of course, you have the evidence that you've been vaccinated held by your GP, and if other countries require you to show proof of that evidence, then that is obviously up to those countries. But we've vaccinated, or we've given the first dose to 11.5 million people, and we have no plan of introducing a vaccine passport.
He used the word discriminatory. That's his own words. They understand fully what they are doing because they themselves told us that that would be discriminatory. And yet here we are today with Nadhim Zahawi saying that potentially they will go ahead and vaccinate 12-year-olds, perhaps without your consent, parents. That's what's being said, as is being reported in the press today. Politics for All reports. I'll just read it for you. 12 to 15-year-olds will be able to override their parents' views on whether to have the COVID jab if they are deemed competent to do so, Nadhim Zahawi has said via Times Radio. So not only did you hear him there admit the vaccine passports being mandated would be discriminatory, now he's saying that he wants to roll them out. He's also saying that they will extend this to all NHS care staff, all NHS staff, and that they may not need your parental consent to jab your 12-year-olds. It started with just 2 weeks to stop the spread. Look where we have ended up. And imagine how long I've been saying to you, where is your red line? When will this stop? Absolute power. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And people thought I'd gone crazy when I used to say to you, I know what tyranny feels like. Please understand, I'm trying to defend you. And here we are. Now, do you think he's going to stop with all NHS staff? Then it will be all the catering companies and all the cleaners that provide the hospitals will have to be jabbed, which will mean the catering industry, hospitality and cleaning services will then start instituting mandatory jab policies for their staff because they can't afford to lose the government contracts. Then it will be all government offices and then all contracts Private companies that contract to any government office will not be able to afford to lose those government contracts, will mandate them for all their staff. And before we know it, you have a situation in this country where you're in a papers, please society. Is that the kind of country you want to live in? And it's why I keep saying resist. You're listening to Maajid Nawaz here on LBC for the regular weekend show, and the time is 1:19.
LBC.
Right.
Nawaz on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Good afternoon. It's Maajid Nawaz here on LBC. And you heard earlier Nadeem Zahawi 6 months ago claiming that rolling out mandatory domestic vaccine passports is not how we do things in this country and that it would be discriminatory, in his own words. Yet this morning, my colleague Tom Sorbrick had him on LBC and asked him why he's U-turned on this promise. And this is what he said.
We learnt a lot about how this virus behaves, how infectious the Delta variant is. No one in this government, not this Prime Minister, it's not in his DNA to want to curtail people's freedoms. But what we know now, and that is the big differentiator, is in large-scale gatherings, especially indoors, the virus will spread.
It's simply wrong what he said, by the way, factually and scientifically and absolutely wrong. The Delta variant is more, can spread more easily, is more infectious for the double jabbed. And that's what the evidence is telling us. The double jabbed are more likely to become infected with Delta and more likely to transmit Delta than those who recovered from COVID naturally. Just look to the Oxford study, as I said, as published by Reuters. Look it up. What the vaccines minister just said there is factually wrong. There's just no doubt about it. It's just not what the science is saying.